In late December, the air temperature drops only slightly. The water is dark. The sky, on a clear night, is very large. It is into this environment, flat, featureless, swallowing light, that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 descended on the night of December 29, 1972. The aircraft did not know it was descending. By 1972, Eastern Airlines was one of the largest commercial carriers in the United States. Founded in the early 1920s as a mail route operator, it had grown across 5 decades into a major trunk airline, running high-frequency routes up and down the eastern seaboard and into Florida, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Its hub at Miami International Airport was one of the busiest in the country. The airline employed tens of thousands of people. It was, by any conventional measure, an established institution, part of the infrastructure of American travel in the post-war era. That year, Eastern took delivery of a new aircraft. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was, at the time of its introduction, among the most technologically sophisticated commercial airliners ever built. Wide-bodied, quiet, powered by 3 Rolls-Royce RB211 turbofan engines, one under each wing and one mounted at the base of the tail, it represented a significant leap in passenger aviation. It could carry more than 250 passengers. Its autopilot system was advanced. Its instrumentation was dense and precise. Lockheed had designed it to compete directly with the Douglas DC-10, and Eastern had committed to the aircraft early, placing substantial orders before the TriStar had completed its certification process. The L-1011 carried with it a sense of confidence, the confidence that engineering had advanced to a point where the margin for error on a commercial flight had become nearly theoretical. The aircraft's systems were redundant. Its crew requirements were rigorous. Its safety record, in the brief time it had been in service, was clean. Flight 401 was operating one of these aircraft. It was registered as N310EA. It had been in service for less than a year. In aviation, new aircraft carry a particular kind of trust, the trust of recent design, recent testing, recent validation. That trust was not misplaced in the L-1011 itself. The aircraft, on the night of December 29, was functioning. Every major system was operational. The plane was not the variable that would determine what happened next. Captain Robert Alban Loft had been flying for Eastern Airlines since 1945. By December 1972, he had accumulated more than 29,000 flight hours, a number that placed him among the most experienced commercial pilots in the country. He was 55 years old. He knew the routes, the procedures, the aircraft. He was, by the accounts of colleagues who flew with him, methodical and calm. Not a man who invited carelessness, and not a man who had given the airline any reason to doubt him across nearly 3 decades of service. First Officer Albert John Stockstill was younger, 39 years old, and had logged approximately 5,800 hours of flight time, with 306 of those hours on the L-1011 specifically. He was qualified, current, and experienced enough on the aircraft to handle its systems with familiarity. He occupied the right seat that evening in the normal course of his duties. Nothing about his assignment that night was irregular. Flight engineer Donald Lewis Repo was 51. His role aboard the L-1011 was to manage the aircraft's systems, fuel, hydraulics, pressurization, electrics, from a dedicated panel behind and between the 2 pilots. Repo had a reputation for thoroughness. He had served in the United States Army Air Forces during the Second World War before transitioning to commercial aviation. He had worked his way through the ranks at Eastern over many years. Those who knew him described a man who took his responsibilities seriously and did not overlook details. 3 men. A combined flight experience that ran well into the tens of thousands of hours. A crew that had been assembled, trained, and certified specifically to operate this class of aircraft on this class of route. There was also a 4th member of the flight deck that evening, Eastern Airlines instructor pilot who was traveling in the cockpit jump seat as an observer, a routine practice of the period. His presence added a 4th set of eyes to the flight deck. It did not change what was about to happen. On paper, And by every standard the industry applied in 1972, this was a competent crew operating a reliable aircraft on a familiar route. Nothing about the composition of Flight 401's flight deck suggested vulnerability. That is part of what made the investigation, later, so important. Flight 401 departed John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York at 9:20 p.m., approximately 11 minutes behind schedule. It was a Friday evening, the week between Christmas and New Year's Day. The passenger manifest reflected that moment in the calendar: 163 people aboard, many of them holiday travelers, families returning to Florida or heading there to visit relatives, people carrying the particular looseness of the end of a year. The flight was not full, but it was well occupied. The route was routine. JFK to Miami International, a flight Eastern operated multiple times daily, a corridor the airline knew as well as any it flew. The L-1011 climbed out over the Atlantic, turned south, and settled into cruise altitude. The cabin crew moved through their service. Passengers read, or slept, or looked out at the darkness over the ocean. There was nothing about the early portion of the flight that distinguished it from the hundreds of similar flights Eastern operated every week. The weather in Miami that night was acceptable. Visibility was reported as adequate for approach. There were no significant meteorological concerns flagged in the crew's pre-flight briefing. The aircraft was performing normally. Radio communications with air traffic control were routine and unremarkable through the cruise portion of the flight. At approximately 11:32 p.m., as Flight 401 began its descent toward Miami, the crew commenced the standard pre-landing checklist. It was a sequence they had performed many times. Each item was called and verified in order. The aircraft descended through the Florida night, the lights of the Miami metropolitan area visible ahead and below, the darkness of the Everglades spreading to the west. By all available evidence, no one aboard Flight 401 had any reason to believe the evening would end any differently than it had begun, ordinarily, quietly, with the aircraft rolling to its gate and the passengers collecting their belongings and moving on into their nights. The checklist reached the landing gear. On the L-1011, the landing gear system included a set of indicator lights on the flight deck, small bulbs designed to illuminate green when each of the three gear assemblies had locked into the down position. During a normal approach, the crew would lower the gear, the lights would confirm all three assemblies were down and locked, and the checklist would continue. It was a routine step, repeated on every flight, on every approach, around the world, thousands of times a day across commercial aviation. On the approach into Miami that night, the nose gear indicator did not illuminate. First Officer Stockstill lowered the gear handle at approximately 11:34 p.m. Two lights came on. The third, the one corresponding to the nose gear, did not. Stockstill reported the anomaly to Captain Loft. Loft instructed Miami Approach Control that they would need to enter a holding pattern while the crew investigated. Air Traffic Control cleared the aircraft to climb to 2,000 feet and hold west of the airport over the Everglades. The instruction was acknowledged. The aircraft turned west. What followed was not panic. It was, in a precise sense, the opposite of panic. It was focused, procedural attention directed at a specific technical problem. The crew attempted to recycle the gear handle, lowering and raising the assembly to see if a second attempt would trigger the indicator. It did not. Loft then asked Flight Engineer Repo to go below into the avionics bay, an access point beneath the flight deck, to visually inspect the nose gear assembly directly. Repo descended into the bay. On the flight deck, the remaining crew continued working the problem. Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill attempted to remove the landing gear indicator light fixture itself, to determine whether the bulb had simply burned out. This was a recognized procedure. The indicator assembly on the L-1011 was designed to allow the bulb to be checked and replaced. But the fixture was difficult to remove. It resisted. The two pilots worked at it. At some point during this process, the precise moment is not recorded, the autopilot's altitude hold function was inadvertently disengaged. The most likely cause, determined later by investigators, was that someone on the flight deck had leaned against the control yoke, applying just enough pressure to disengage the system. On the L-1011, the autopilot could be overridden with a relatively light input. A warning chime sounded briefly. The crew did not register it, or registered it and did not process its significance in the context of what else was demanding their attention. The aircraft began to descend. It descended slowly, at a rate of approximately 200 feet per minute, gradual enough that it produced no sensation of dropping, no change in engine noise, no physical signal that would have been obvious to anyone on the flight deck who was not watching the altimeter. The Everglades spread out below in total darkness, flat and featureless and offering nothing that a human eye, or an inattentive instrument scan, would read as an approaching surface. At 11:40 p.m., an altitude warning briefly captured the crew's attention. First Officer Stockstill asked, "We did something to the altitude." Captain Loft responded, asking whether they were still at 2,000 feet. The exchange was captured on the cockpit voice recorder. It was the last moment at which the situation could have been recovered. The altimeter showed the aircraft was not at 2,000 feet. The crew had approximately 10 seconds. At 11:42 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 struck the surface of the Everglades at an altitude of approximately 0 feet, at an airspeed of 227 miles per hour, in level flight, with its engines producing power and its wings level. The aircraft was intact. It was functioning. It simply was no longer at a safe altitude, and no one had noticed in time to arrest the descent. The nose gear indicator light, investigators would later determine, had failed because of a burned-out bulb. The gear itself was down and locked. There had been nothing wrong with the aircraft. The L-1011 struck the Everglades in 3 distinct sequences, each separated by fractions of a second, each recorded in the physical evidence that investigators would later collect from a debris field stretching nearly a mile across the sawgrass. The left wingtip touched first. At 227 miles per hour, contact with the surface was not a collision in the way the word is commonly understood, it was more immediate than that, more total. The wing folded. The left engine separated. The fuselage, still moving forward at speed, rotated slightly left and then made contact with the ground along its underside. The forward section, the flight deck, the nose, absorbed the primary force of the impact and came apart. The center and rear sections of the aircraft continued forward through the sawgrass, decelerating violently, breaking into large pieces as they went. The entire sequence lasted approximately 1 second. What the debris field told investigators afterward was precise and consistent. The aircraft had not dived. It had not entered an unusual attitude. It had flown, in controlled and level flight, directly into the surface of the Earth at cruise approach speed. The technical term used in aviation accident investigation is controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. The aircraft did everything correctly. The crew, in the final minutes, did not do the one thing that was required of them, monitor the altitude. The sawgrass and shallow water absorbed portions of the wreckage in ways that were, in certain respects, mitigating. The flat terrain meant no secondary impact against elevated ground. The soft substrate absorbed some kinetic energy that a harder surface would not have. The aircraft did not burn, the fuel did not ignite in the manner investigators might have expected. These were not small details. They are part of the reason that 101 people survived. 75 did not. Captain Loft survived the initial impact but died before rescue arrived. Flight engineer Repo survived the impact and was pulled from the wreckage alive, but died in hospital approximately 30 hours later. First Officer Stockstill died at the scene. The aircraft that had been, 11 minutes earlier, on a routine approach to one of the most familiar airports in the Eastern network, was now distributed across approximately 1 mile of the Western Everglades, in darkness, in water, in sawgrass, 11 miles from the nearest road. Those who survived the impact did not, in most accounts, describe the immediate aftermath as chaotic. They described it as quiet. The cessation of engine noise, the stillness that followed the violence of the breakup, the darkness, these created an environment that survivors later characterized not as the absence of something, but as the presence of a particular kind of silence that none of them had encountered before. People who had been seated in the rear sections of the aircraft found themselves in open air, the fuselage around them gone or rearranged, the sawgrass close, the water, warm, shallow, dark, rising to their waists or their chests depending on where they had come to rest. Some survivors were conscious and largely uninjured. Others were conscious and seriously hurt. Others were not conscious at all, held above the waterline only by the wreckage around them or by the actions of those nearby who still had the capacity to act. The darkness was nearly total. The debris was spread across a wide area, which meant that many survivors could not see other survivors. They could hear them, voices calling out, some coherent, some not, but the sawgrass and the wreckage and the distance between sections of the aircraft meant that the crash site was not a single location. It was a dispersed collection of locations, each one isolated from the others by terrain that resisted movement. Survivors who were able to move described the difficulty of the sawgrass immediately, its edges cut, its density slowed progress to near zero, and the mud beneath the water offered no stable footing. Moving through it in daylight would have been difficult. Moving through it in darkness, injured, disoriented, was something of a different order entirely. What the survivor accounts collectively describe, in the immediate period after impact, is a series of small, individual decisions made by people operating on instinct and whatever physical capacity the impact had left them. A passenger holding another passenger's head above the waterline. A flight attendant moving through the wreckage, calling out, accounting for the people around her. A man freeing himself from his seat and pulling a child clear of the water. These actions were not coordinated. There was no one directing them. They occurred because the people performing them were still alive and still capable, and because the alternative was to do nothing. The Everglades, for its part, was indifferent. The sawgrass did not yield. The water did not warm. The darkness did not lift. The sounds that filled the air were the sounds of the place itself, insects, the movement of water, the distant calls of birds disturbed by the impact, layered now with the sounds of human beings in extremity. No one on the ground knew where they were. No road ran near them. No structure stood within miles. The nearest lights were those of Miami, visible on the eastern horizon as a faint glow, present but unreachable, a marker of a world that continued on without any knowledge of what had just occurred 11 miles to its west. They waited. Most of them had no other option. At 11:42 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 disappeared from the radar scope at Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center. The controller handling the flight, Robert Marquis, had been in routine contact with the aircraft through its holding pattern. The return, the small symbol representing the aircraft on his screen, simply ceased. There was no distress call. No final transmission. No indication from the crew that anything was wrong. The aircraft was present on the scope, and then it was not. Marquis attempted to raise the flight on radio. There was no response. He attempted again. Silence. He immediately notified his supervisor. Within minutes, the alert had moved through the system, to Eastern Airlines operations at Miami, to the Homestead Air Force Base radar facility, to the United States Coast Guard, to the Dade County Public Safety Department. The machinery of emergency response began to activate, but it activated in a state of fundamental uncertainty. No one knew exactly where the aircraft had gone down. Radar data would later help narrow the location, but in those first minutes, the search area was broad, and it was, almost entirely, Everglades. The first airborne responders were Coast Guard helicopters out of Opelika. They lifted off and moved west, scanning the darkness below with searchlights. The Everglades from the air at night returns very little, the sawgrass absorbs light rather than reflecting it, the water channels appear only as the absence of texture, and there are no landmarks to use as reference points. The pilots flew search patterns, methodical and slow, covering grid sections of the marsh. The first visual contact with the wreckage was made from the air. Debris was visible in the searchlight beams, pale fragments of aircraft structure distributed across the sawgrass in a pattern that told the pilots immediately that this was not a survivable crash site. That initial assessment was wrong, but it was understandable. The scale of the debris field, the darkness, and the apparent totality of the breakup gave no early indication that more than 100 people were alive within it. Airboats, flat-bottomed vessels driven by large aircraft-style propellers, the standard mode of transit through the Everglades, were mobilized from multiple directions. Eastern Airlines operated airboats in the area for training purposes. Those were among the first to respond. Frog hunters working the Everglades that night, men who knew the terrain intimately, were contacted and directed toward the site. Dade County Fire Rescue units mobilized. The effort that converged on the crash site over the following hours was improvised, multi-agency, and reliant in significant part on the local knowledge of people who worked and lived at the edges of that landscape. The terrain imposed a particular kind of difficulty on the rescue operation that cannot be overstated. The water was shallow enough that helicopters could not land near the wreckage without risking damage from the sawgrass and submerged debris. The airboats could move quickly across open water but slowed to a crawl through dense vegetation. Rescuers who reached the site on foot or by boat found themselves working in chest-high water in darkness, moving through sawgrass that cut through clothing, pulling survivors from wreckage that was partially submerged and structurally unpredictable. They found people alive throughout the debris field. Survivors in the water, some conscious and able to assist their own extraction, others unconscious and requiring full physical support. The flight attendants who had survived, several were among the more mobile survivors in the early phase of the rescue, had in many cases already moved through the immediate wreckage around them, doing what they could before help arrived. Their actions in those intervening minutes, working without equipment, without communication, without any coordination beyond what they could manage themselves, contributed directly to the number of people who were still alive when the airboats reached them. The rescue operation continued through the night and into the early hours of December 30th. By approximately 2 a.m., the active phase of the extraction was largely complete. 101 survivors had been pulled from the Everglades and transported to hospitals across the Miami area. 75 people had not survived, some killed by the impact, others lost in the water and the darkness in the time before help arrived. It was the deadliest aviation accident in Florida's history at that time. It was also, given the violence of the impact and the nature of the terrain, a rescue operation that recovered more survivors than the initial reports from the air had suggested was possible. The National Transportation Safety Board opened its investigation into the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 within hours of the accident. What investigators had at their disposal was, by the standards of 1972, a relatively complete evidentiary record. The L-1011 was equipped with both a flight data recorder and a cockpit voice recorder, instruments that had become mandatory on large commercial aircraft in the preceding years and that would prove, in this case, to be the primary tools through which the final minutes of the flight could be understood. The flight data recorder documented the aircraft's performance with precision. Altitude, airspeed, heading, control inputs, engine parameters, all of it captured at regular intervals throughout the flight. When investigators plotted the altitude trace for the period the aircraft spent in its holding pattern over the Everglades, what they saw was unambiguous. Beginning at some point after the aircraft had been established in the hold at 2,000 feet, the altitude began to decrease. Slowly, consistently, without interruption. The descent continued for approximately 4 minutes before impact. At no point during that descent did the rate of change become dramatic enough to trigger an automatic warning system. At no point did the engines surge or the airspeed change in a way that would have been physically obvious to the crew. The aircraft simply flew, in perfect aerodynamic order, toward the ground. The cockpit voice recorder told the human side of that same 4 minutes. What it captured was a flight deck fully engaged with the landing gear indicator problem, voices discussing the indicator, the gear, the circuit breaker, the bulb. Repos descent into the avionics bay. The sound of the indicator fixture being worked at by loft and stockstill. The conversation was procedural, focused, unhurried. There was no indication in any of the recorded exchanges that any member of the crew recognized that the aircraft was no longer at its assigned altitude. At approximately 11:40 p.m., the recording captured First Officer Stockstill's observation, "We did something to the altitude," followed by Loft's question about whether they were still at 2,000 feet. Investigators determined that this exchange occurred when the aircraft was at approximately 900 feet and descending. The crew had, at that moment, recognized that something was wrong with their altitude. They had not yet identified what it was, or how far it had progressed. They had approximately 10 seconds to act before impact. It was not enough time. The investigation established the probable cause with a clarity that was, in retrospect, almost painful in its simplicity. The flight crew had failed to monitor the flight instruments during the approach to landing, and had failed to notice the unintended descent of the aircraft. The probable cause, as stated in the NTSB's final report, was the preoccupation of all three members of the flight crew with a malfunction of the nose gear position indicating system, specifically, a burned-out light bulb, which had diverted their attention away from the instruments at the precise moment when instrument monitoring was essential. The autopilot disengagement remained technically uncertain. The most probable explanation, based on the available evidence, was that an inadvertent input to the control yoke, a hand or arm making contact with the column while attention was directed elsewhere, had applied enough force to override the altitude hold function. The system had responded as designed. A tone had sounded. The crew had not registered it as significant in the context of the other demands on their attention. There was no mechanical failure of consequence. The aircraft was sound. The engines were producing power. The control surfaces were functional. The autopilot was working correctly until it was inadvertently overridden. Even the landing gear, the object of the crew's complete attention for those final minutes, was not actually malfunctioning, the gear was down and locked. The bulb that had initiated the entire sequence of events was burned out. It was a component worth, by some estimates, approximately $2. What the investigation also found, and what it documented in its recommendations, was that the conditions that produced the accident were not unique to Flight 401 or to its crew. The L-1011's autopilot disengagement mechanism, the light pressure required to override it, had been flagged as a potential concern in earlier analyses. The absence of any systematic protocol for ensuring that at least one crew member maintained primary responsibility for aircraft state monitoring during a non-critical fault investigation was an industry-wide gap, not an Eastern-specific one. The crew of Flight 401 had made an error. But the environment in which that error became fatal had been constructed, in part, by design conventions and training assumptions that the industry had not yet examined closely enough. The NTSB issued a series of recommendations following the investigation. They addressed autopilot design, cockpit procedure, and crew coordination. The recommendations were noted, catalogued, and referred to the relevant authorities. Their full significance would take years, and additional accidents, to be completely understood. In the months following the crash, Eastern Airlines made a decision that was, from a purely operational standpoint, unremarkable. The wreckage of N310EA, scattered across the Everglades, contained components that had survived the impact in serviceable condition. Aircraft parts, galley equipment, avionics components, other hardware, were inspected, assessed, and where they met the required standards, removed from the wreck and returned to inventory. Some of these parts were subsequently installed in other L-1011 aircraft within Eastern's fleet. It was standard industry practice. It was economical. It was, by the regulatory framework of the time, entirely permissible. What followed was not standard. Beginning in 1973, Eastern Airlines began receiving reports from crew members aboard specific aircraft in its L-1011 fleet, aircraft that, in at least some cases, had been fitted with components recovered from Flight 401. The reports described encounters with two figures, a man identified as Captain Bob Loft, and a man identified as Flight Engineer Don Repo. The figures were described as appearing in the cabins of the aircraft, in the galley areas, in the cockpit jump seat. They were described as looking entirely normal, not as apparitions in any theatrical sense, but as crew members, present and unremarkable in appearance, until the moment they were not. One account, cited in multiple subsequent investigations of the phenomenon, involved a flight captain who reported a conversation with a man he recognized as loft-seated in first class before departure, only to have the figure vanish as the captain reached toward him. Another account involved a flight engineer who reported seeing Repo's face reflected in the galley oven window of an L-1011 in service. A flight attendant reported a conversation with a uniformed Eastern crew member who identified himself and then disappeared. These accounts came not from passengers, from crew members. From people who had known Loft and Repo, who could identify them by face, and who filed internal reports through Eastern's own reporting mechanisms. The reports were not publicized at the time. Eastern Airlines did not encourage discussion of them. The airline's position, to the extent it had one, was that the accounts were the product of grief, stress, and the psychological aftermath of a traumatic event that had affected the entire organization. That explanation was reasonable. The crash of Flight 401 had killed colleagues, friends, people known throughout the Eastern system. Grief produces its own phenomena. The mind, under pressure, does things that are difficult to account for precisely. John G. Fuller, an American journalist and author who had previously written about anomalous phenomena, investigated the reports and published his findings in 1976 under the title The Ghost of Flight 401. Fuller conducted interviews with crew members and documented the accounts in detail. His book brought the story to public attention and gave it a shape that the internal Eastern reports had not. The accounts he collected were consistent in certain respects. The figures appeared specifically on aircraft carrying salvaged parts from the wreck, they were identified specifically as Loft and Repo, and they behaved, in the accounts given, not as threatening presences but as observers, or in some accounts, as warnings. One account described Repo appearing to a crew member before a flight and indicating, through gesture or expression, that there was a mechanical problem with the aircraft. The problem, in that account, was subsequently found and confirmed. Eastern Airlines, according to multiple reports from the period, eventually made the decision to remove the salvaged components from its operational fleet. The airline did not confirm this publicly, and did not issue any statement connecting the removal to the crew sightings. The components were withdrawn. The sightings, by most accounts, ceased. What is documentable is this: the reports existed, were filed through internal channels, were investigated at some level within the organization, and were numerous and specific enough that they reached the attention of airline management. Whether the encounters described in those reports reflect something that requires explanation beyond psychology and grief is a question that sits outside the boundaries of what investigation can resolve. What is not outside those boundaries is the fact that the people who filed the reports were aviation professionals, trained, disciplined, accustomed to operating in environments that demanded precision and accuracy. They reported what they reported. Eastern received those reports and, eventually, acted. The Everglades retained what it had taken. The parts that had been recovered and redistributed through the fleet were, in the end, removed. And the two men most associated with the sightings, Loft and Repo, remained, in the documentation of the period, as figures who had not entirely finished with the aircraft they had flown. The crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 entered the aviation safety record as a case study in a failure mode that the industry had not, until that point, fully confronted. The aircraft had not failed. The weather had not intervened. No external force had acted on the flight. What had happened was internal. A crew's attention had moved, collectively and completely, away from the task of flying the aircraft, and the aircraft had descended until there was no longer any room to descend. The NTSB's recommendations following the investigation contributed to a shift in how commercial aviation thought about the human element of flight. Over the following years, as additional accidents with similar human factors characteristics accumulated in the record, the industry began to formalize what it had previously left to intuition and individual judgment. In 1979, United Airlines introduced the first structured crew resource management program, a training philosophy built on the principle that cockpit errors were rarely the product of individual incompetence, and were more commonly the product of failures in communication, task distribution, and situational awareness among crews who were each, individually, capable. The program spread across the industry. By the mid-1980s, CRM training had become standard across major carriers. By the 1990s, it was a regulatory requirement in most aviation jurisdictions worldwide. Flight 401 was not the only accident that informed the development of crew resource management. It was one of several. But it was among the clearest: the cockpit voice recording, the flight data record, the unambiguous reconstruction of those final 4 minutes, that made it a foundational case in aviation safety education. It is studied in flight training programs to this day. The scenario it presents is used specifically because it illustrates how capable, experienced, well-intentioned professionals can lose situational awareness entirely while remaining, in every other respect, fully functional. The accounting that follows from this is uncomfortable to make but not impossible. The principles established in the wake of Flight 401 and the accidents that followed it have been applied to tens of thousands of flights across more than 4 decades of commercial aviation. The errors they are designed to prevent, failures of crew coordination, of instrument monitoring, of task prioritization, are precisely the errors that brought N310EA into the Everglades. How many flights those principles have protected, how many descents they have caught before the altimeter reached zero, is not a number that can be calculated. It is, by nature, the count of things that did not happen. What did happen was this: on the night of December 29, 1972, a functioning aircraft carrying 176 people descended into a flat, dark marsh because the 3 men responsible for monitoring its altitude were looking at a light bulb. 75 people did not survive. 101 did. The investigation that followed was thorough and honest. The industry that received its findings changed, slowly and imperfectly but genuinely, in response. The Everglades did not change. It remains as it was, flat, wide, dark at night, indifferent to the things that have occurred within it. The sawgrass grows where the debris field was. The water moves as it has always moved, slowly, toward the sea. There is no marker at the site. There is nothing, from the air, to indicate that anything happened there. What remains is in the record, in the training manuals, in the cockpit procedures, in the institutional memory of an industry that looked at what a burned-out light bulb had cost and decided, however gradually, that it could not afford to learn that lesson again.